Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome on this very cold and very wet January evening. So thank you all for making the effort, and especially to Angela, who's driven all the way from Meath this evening. So thank you. So Dr. Angela Byrne is a historian specialising in the experiences of migrants and women in the past. She works at the Dictionary of Irish Biography in the Royal Irish Academy. That's her day job. And she's previously held research and lecturing positions at the universities of Toronto, Greenwich, Ulster and Maynooth, and at EPIC, the Irish Emigrant Museum. She has published widely and has held research fellowships across Europe and in North America. Her most recent books include Anarchy and Authority. That's what the talk is about this evening. And the subtitle to that is Irish Encounters with Romanov Russia. That was published in 2024 by Lilliput Press. And her newest book, Finding Mary, The Untold Story of an Inishowen Murder, 1844, was published last year by Four Courts Press. Angela is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Follow that, lads. Very impressive. Thank you, Angela.
Hi, Falter of Galer. Míle buíochas le Stephanie, and thank you all for coming to join me this evening. It's a bit grim outside there, so I wasn't sure how many people would brave the elements this evening. As Stephanie mentioned, I'm going to talk to you this evening about some Tipperary connections in my recent book, Anarchy and Authority. And just before I get into the kind of Tipperary connections that I'm sure you're all keen to hear about, I just wanted to acknowledge that the history of Irish connections with Russia can seem like a little bit of a difficult history, especially with Russia's ongoing illegal invasion and the war crimes that they are committing in Ukraine. So it can be a bit uncomfortable maybe to think about Irish links with Russia in the past. And my book focuses on the 18th and 19th centuries, but really since 2014 and even 2009 with the invasion of Georgia, Russian imperialism seems like anything but past, anything but history. But I think it's profitable to look at the elements of our history that make us a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that looking at the Irish in imperial or Romanov Russia offers us some insights that are valuable. So the first thing, because all history in a way is the history of the present, can help Irish people to understand better the long roots of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conflict between those two countries. And to realise as well that Ireland and Ukraine share a common history of imperial oppression. We have both historically been denied access to our language. We have both experienced entirely avoidable catastrophic famines in our past. And we both had historically dissident communities living in exile who were striving towards independence. And then the second thing that I think my book can do is give an alternative view on the Irish diaspora and Irish roles in the global history of empire. So the Irish military diaspora in Russia, who is the first section of the book, they were small in number, but they wielded power at the imperial court in Russia way out of proportion to their number. They achieved fame, they amassed wealth, they navigated regional power networks, they infiltrated the court networks, they were careful to marry their daughters into local noble families to consolidate power and wealth, and they retained aspects of their Irish identity as well when it suited their social standing and their career advancement. And you can read all about that in chapter 1 of the book. So, during 300 years of autocratic rule, the Romanovs created the largest land empire in history that extended over a vast territory from the Baltic Sea to the Bering Strait in the Far East. Irish-born soldiers and diplomats went there in search of professional opportunities. Irish-born travel writers went there looking for the Orient of their imaginations. And capitalist adventurers, especially in the 19th century, went there looking for profit. They were keen to cash in on the Russian Empire's rapid, large-scale industrialization. the Irish were never a large community in Romanov Russia, but they were in the right places. They were in positions of power. The Irish who visited Russia out of curiosity from the 18th century onwards included a Clonmel native called William Bagwell. He went there in 1795. And how I came across his name was in the letters of an Irish officer in the Imperial Russian service called Anthony O'Hara. And Anthony was in the habit of writing to his cousin Charles, who was an MP and who lived in Sligo. And this is because he needed to nurture a power connection there. That's all explained in the book. But in Anthony's letters to his cousin in Sligo, he mentions Monsieur Bagwell because he writes in French. And Bagwell was an MP for Tipperary himself. He was a privy councillor, and it turns out that his father had gone to school in London with Anthony O'Hara's father. So this this kind of genteel traveller from Clonmel visiting Russia finds himself in this Jacobite exile network in Imperial Russia. And you'll be already starting to get the picture that a lot of the Irish people in Russia who I've studied where they had access to the highest strata of Russian society. And that high strata of the Russian nobility was a tiny minority of the overall population of the empire. But they had lavish lifestyles that were built on the encirclement of millions of Russian people and other people in the Russian Empire, and built on the spoils of imperial conquest in the Caucasus, in what's now Poland and the Baltic states, in what's now Central Asia, and into Siberia. So when Irish visitors to Russia enjoyed hospitality in noble palaces, they were complicit in lots of ways in the economic and legal base of Romanov power and noble wealth. And some of those Irish visitors were well aware of the shocking abuses that were committed by some of the Russian nobility against the enserved people who lived on their estates. So just to give one example, that is Cork-born Martha Wilmot, who's pictured there on your left. She lived in Russia for nearly 6 years during the Napoleonic Wars. She recorded in her diaries and letters some examples of Russian nobles abusing the enserved people on their estates. But she also did some mental gymnastics to convince herself that the Russian serfs were still better off than the Irish peasantry, because she said the Russians didn't go hungry, but the Irish went hungry all the time. Serfdom was abolished in Russia in 1861, but on terms that were unfavourable to the peasantry. And late 19th century Russia was characterized by repression of all forms of dissent. Any kind of dissenting voice was crushed. Growing nationalism in places like present-day Poland, Georgia, and Ukraine, any growing radicalism, any socialist revolutionism, any of these ideas that were nourished by disillusionment with previous failed attempts at reform in Russia were met with brutal oppression. There was no free press. The state stamped out any revolutionary ideas, but there was an Irish person at the heart of the exiled revolutionary Russian community in London, and that was another Cork person, incidentally, Lily Bull-Voynich. She spent 2 years in Russia. She learned the language. She worked as a translator for the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom in London, and she smuggled banned revolutionary pamphlets into what's now Ukraine. One of her novels, The Gadfly, later became the most popular novel in the Soviet Union. And just watch out later this year for a new edition of that book by Lilliput Press, and I've written the introduction to that. Other Irish visitors to the Russian Empire as well, like Michael Davitt, were alive to the repression and brutality that minorities in the empire suffered, including Jewish people. So, all of this is to say that the Tipperary people in Imperial Russia, who I'm going to talk about now, were embedded in these complicated relationships. They were in 19th century Russia in times of war, epidemics, imperial expansion. And just to note as well that the people I'm going to talk about this evening, it's very male-centred, and it's not representative of the kind of gender parity that's in my book, which is about half of the case studies are male and half are female. It's as well to start with the person who's probably the most famous Tipperary person to ever live in Russia, and that would be the Dr James Quinlan. He was born in Tipperary in the mid-18th century. His father was from near Carrick-on-Suir. James himself was educated at Leuven in the Irish College there. And some accounts say that he was medic to Napoleon's Grand Army during its campaign in Russia. Other sources say that James had actually been in Russia since the 1790s. It's all a bit murky. The records are patchy. But he remained in Moscow after the French invasion of 1812. Some say he was captured by the Russians, but either way, he went on to become Surgeon General to the Tzar and chief of one of the royal hospitals. When he died in Moscow in 1826, he left 28,000 rubles in his will to provide for the education of his family back home. He didn't have any children of his own. And the obituary of him that was published in the Tipperary Free Press said, "The noble qualities of his heart endeared him in a foreign land to all who were acquainted with him." And I just popped up on the slide there a contemporary impression of the burning of Moscow, which was famously instigated by the Muscovites themselves so that the French couldn't capture the city, and an impression of the Irish College at Leuven, where James Quinlan studied medicine. But we're about to get into a fair bit of detail now with, even if they're not the most famous, they are some of the most significant Tipperary connections in the long history of the Irish in Imperial Russia. And that's Benjamin Bloomfield, who was a diplomat in Russia in the 1820s, and his son John, who was an envoy to Russia in the 1820s and then came back again at a more senior diplomatic position in the 1830s and 40s. John was born in Tipperary in 1802, and in 1839 he was made secretary to the British Embassy in St. Petersburg. Now, he was a career diplomat for life, his whole career. It was from just 16 years of age when he was assigned as attaché to the British Embassy in Vienna, and he climbed the ladder from there. He clearly had the right personality for diplomatic life. Shortly after his move to Vienna, he was just a teenager. Cork-born Martha Wilmot, who I mentioned earlier on, she found herself in Vienna at the same time as wife of the chaplain to the British Embassy, William Bradford. Now, Martha knew John Bloomfield and his parents, but she and her husband grew close to him during his time there as attaché. She wrote that he was a very fine, sweet young man, handsome and much admired. She said her husband was very fond of him and feels towards him as if he were his own son. She described him as having a handsome, artless, sweet, unassuming exterior. And the Bradfords thought so highly of John Bloomfield that William sketched his portrait, not this very nicely finished one here, but a different pencil one. And indeed, William Bradford was the only one who visited John Bloomfield when he was at death's door in Vienna. He had caught scarlet fever, which was a highly contagious, very deadly disease, and all of his other friends had abandoned him. So he survived that and went on to become a quite well-regarded diplomat. He was in that role for 5 decades in various guises. But life at the embassy in Vienna prepared him well for his career. Vienna was at the epicenter of European politics. It had a glittering social calendar. And when he was there, as a young attaché, he had the advantage of contact with Martha Wilmot, who herself had lived for over 6 years in Russia. So doubtless she would have given him all the information about politics, culture, society, and so on, just before he headed off to his role in St. Petersburg. He wasn't the first Irish diplomat to work in St. Petersburg by any means. He had been preceded by a Limerick man in 1814 called Sir Gore Owsley. He had actually been the British ambassador to Persia and was sent from there to Russia. So he travelled through the Caucasus Mountains, overland, the long, long journey from Persia up to St. Petersburg on horseback. When they were going through the mountains, he and his family had a guard of 200 Cossacks because the Caucasus Mountains were considered so dangerous to travel through. And he arrived in Moscow in 1814. 2 years after the city had been burnt to the ground by its own inhabitants. And he described the city still being in ashes 2 years later. It still hadn't been completely rebuilt. And he said that was a horrid proof of French atrocity. Another Irish attaché in St. Petersburg, just before John Bloomfield, was the Cork man, John Brabazon Ponsonby. He was an attaché at the embassy in 1832. And curiously, it might be him who was responsible for the display of a pair of Irish ancient gold torques at the All Russia Industrial Display in 1829 to 33. You know, in the Victorian age, these kind of industrial displays were a great thing. They would open these great halls, put on display all sorts of arts, crafts, and industrial manufactures. And there was a pair of Irish gold torques displayed at one of these in Russia, possibly thanks to Ponsonby from Cork. There were many other examples as well. Some of the more interesting ones include Robert French of Monivea. He was secretary to the British Embassy in St. Petersburg in the 1860s. And during that time, he met a Russian noblewoman called Sofia Kindyakova. Her family held extensive properties in Simbirsk, now Ulyanovsk, and in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And their daughter, Kathleen French, was born in Brussels, but was raised on her grandparents' Simbirsk estate. And her letters and diaries were used to good effect by an Australian journalist for a book about her life about 15 years ago. So this is all kind of more context for the other Irish who preceded and followed John Bloomfield to St. Petersburg. To introduce his father, Benjamin, before looking in detail at what the two of them were up to in Russia. Benjamin was born in Tipperary but was whisked off to England at an early age for his education. He entered the British Army. He fought against the United Irishmen at Vinegar Hill in 1798. After 3 years as MP for Plymouth, he was knighted, and he served 5 years as private secretary to the Prince Regent. Then he fell from favour and was reassigned to the diplomatic corps. At this time, his son John was earning his diplomatic stripes in Vienna. His father, Benjamin, finds his position greatly reduced, his political influence greatly reduced. There was a murky conspiracy at court that saw him lose his position as private secretary to the Prince Regent, and he was dispatched to Stockholm as a minister plenipotentiary, and he remained there for 11 years. His case kind of shows how we consider being a diplomat a very elevated thing and honour, but in his case, it was a form of exile. He was sent off to Stockholm. He was a deeply religious man whose convictions were born during this exile in Sweden. In St. Petersburg, in July 1825, he attended an Anglican church. It was the first time in 2 years that he had gone to church. He said, "I heard an excellent sermon and had the comfort of receiving the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. I cannot describe my feelings." Now, why on earth would St. Petersburg offer an Irishman the chance to reacquaint himself with his Anglican faith? Might seem a bit strange, but by the 1790s, there were so many English and German tradespeople, especially, and merchants living in St. Petersburg, that there was 20,000 Protestants in the city, and they were allowed to worship relatively freely. So during this time, Benjamin gets acquainted in Stockholm with a Wesleyan Methodist preacher. He attends his services in a makeshift church in the city. He becomes totally devoted to his faith. It might even offer him a bit of succour, given his exile from his previous position at court. And it's just curious to note that when he went back to London in the 1830s, his acquaintances noted that you would often come to the front door of his house and find a note there that simply said, "At prayer." In other words, do not disturb. So he stayed in Stockholm for 11 years and then went back to Britain, where he commanded the Woolwich garrison until retiring in Ireland, and he was actually buried in County Offaly, not in Tipperary. But what were the father and son up to together in Russia? They met up in St. Petersburg in summer 1825. Benjamin went to make a 2-month tour of Russia with his son, who was at the time posted to the embassy in St. Petersburg. And John's wife, Georgiana, later published Benjamin's diary from this time, and I'll say a little bit more about her in a minute. So they spent 2 months together in Russia, the father and son. They spent a month in St. Petersburg, and then they went down to Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod. Now, Nizhny is a really interesting place, sitting at the confluence of the Volga and Oka rivers. It was easily, if not always pleasantly, reached from Moscow by boat. And it started to feature more and more in travellers' itineraries in the 19th century because it was fairly accessible and it gave people a glimpse into the Orient. So you could see lots of people from different cultures all over the Russian Empire and further afield assembled at the annual Great Fair. And that fair was the largest in the Russian Empire. It drew traders from Western Europe, the Far East, Persia, and the far north and Siberia. And I've just there a later 19th century impression of the bazaar in the city. Benjamin's diary records that he enjoyed seeing merchants from all parts of the Russian Empire and further afield, from Bukhara, Persia, Armenia. In his words, people so strange to Europeans. He enjoyed the horse fair where he saw Kyrgyz and Kalmyk people camped out, and he said they looked perfectly oriental. He dined with the chief of the Bukhars, enjoying a meal of rice and mutton, and he noted that they gave him cutlery while the Bukhars themselves ate in the traditional way with their fingers. And Nizhny's emergence as an important centre of manufacturing in the 19th century is kind of foreshadowed in Benjamin's diary. He bought a vast amount of soap from one manufacturer, and he remarked, "Russia ought to be a clean country if I judged by the quantity of soap I saw." It's kind of humorous reflection of the manufacturing activity that's going on there. The father and son were career diplomats, so when they're in their posted cities of Stockholm, Vienna, St. Petersburg, wherever, they have to spend their time in appropriate company, in appropriate pursuits. They have to be at particular public and private events, and their calendars are too full to let them get out amongst the people and really experience the culture of a place. So this tour, this 2 months travelling away from the diplomatic and political centre of St. Petersburg, gave them both a window into the life of the majority of the people they were living amongst. But Georgiana's memoir contains some more personal insights to flesh out the family's experiences of Russia in the 19th century. Georgiana married John, the son, in 1845 while he was posted to Russia, and he briefly returned to London for their wedding. This is a depiction of her just 2 years prior to their marriage. But her first impressions of Russia were not good. She was being taken there as a new bride. John was in a hurry to resume his diplomatic work, so they had to travel back to St. Petersburg in a hurry. Georgiana's nose was put a bit out of joint when they had to take a second-class cabin through the Baltic. She had been a maid of honour to Queen Victoria before her marriage, so this might not do. On arriving in the River Neva in St. Petersburg, she was struck with the city's wintry appearance. It was October, the first snow had already fallen, and she didn't like the savage appearance, she said, of the Russian boatmen. She didn't like how they were all dressed in sheepskins, fur caps, and enormous tan, fingerless gloves. And I've here depiction from the 1820s of St. Petersburg at Shrovetide, the opposite end of the winter, but just to give an idea of the amusements of the people in wintertime. Georgiana quickly learned about serfdom and the state of the poor from other English residents in St. Petersburg. She recorded what she learned about all this in her diary, and she noted incidents of hunger and famine in Russia. In Moscow, she saw the famous sight: prisoners in chains heading off on the long march to Siberia. She was deeply affected by the sight, she said, of so many fellow creatures doomed in consequence of fearful crimes to spend the rest of their days in hardship and suffering. And I have here on the slide a depiction of that famous sight, Prisoners for Siberia, made by Bayard Taylor, who's another Irish presence in the diplomatic sphere in Russia in the 1860s. What's really interesting as well about John and Georgiana's time in Russia, it overlaps with the Great Famine here in Ireland. So in summer 1847, reports of the famine start to reach them in Russia. Now, before the full horrors of the calamity became clear to them, Georgiana's concern is mostly for her landed friends and her landed relations. She was English-born, but she was now the wife of an Irish landlord. And she wrote, this is summer 1847, Our last accounts from Ireland were a little less hopeless than they have been, and we trust the worst of the famine is nearly over, for our resources are well nigh exhausted, and I cannot think what those landed proprietors who have nothing to depend on but their rent will do. So she's kind of unfeelingly viewing the famine, and she sees it as an opportunity as well for mass conversion of Catholics to Protestantism. She writes, "May our poor fellow countrymen be raised from the abyss of moral and physical degradation and misery in which they have been so long." So to her, the catastrophe of the famine is a chance for transformation in Ireland. And it's very detached. I think she's geographically detached, but morally detached as well. In Tipperary at this time, she's possibly completely unaware there were evictions, food riots, attacks on landlords, agents and bailiffs. Landlord responses in the region varied to the famine. Some lowered their rents and set up soup kitchens. Others evicted the impoverished. The same picture the country over. But curiously, in 1847 and 48, Russia is visited by another horror, cholera. There are outbreaks resulting in reported 1,100 deaths per day. So in 1848, Georgiana follows medical advice. She panics a little bit, but she also gets medical advice to leave St. Petersburg. She boards a ship for England within 2 days. She wished to avoid infection, but she also wished to avoid the riots that sprang up in response to quarantine measures. And John wrote to her regularly during their separation. He had to remain behind and perform his duties. He described terrible scenes of suffering, the endless processions of coffins through the streets of St. Petersburg, and the people in mourning that he sees all over the streets. In 1850, the couple were advised that John should be posted to a location that was less trying to Georgiana's health, and they relocated to Berlin in 1851. The preface to her memoir, Georgiana says, "Just as every pawn is necessary in a game of chess, so the humblest individual fills a part on the great stage of life which no other person, however superior in talent and capacity, could fill." Does this hold true for her and John's time in the British Embassy in St. Petersburg? I'm not sure. But the Bloomfields, as landed Irish people, their experiences in Russia over the course of 3, nearly 4 decades, give us glimpses into court intrigue in Britain, how diplomacy functions both as a social elevator and a form of exile, and how news of the catastrophic famine in Ireland was understood by Irish people who were far from home. And to move on to a more modern, or the tail end of my study, Sir Michael Francis O'Dwyer. He was born in Tipperary in 1864, and he was in the British Civil Service. That was his career, and he decided in his early 30s to take an 18-month career break from the civil service to learn Russian and travel around Russia and Central Asia. He was born in Barronstown. He was the son of a minor landowner and educated at Oxford. And after his sabbatical in Russia, his little career break, he was appointed to the Punjab Northwestern Boundary Commission, and that sent him to a notoriously violent region in India. He described himself as an Irish nationalist. Now, you can make your own mind up when I'm finished talking about him, whether a person with his views can be described as such. He thought Ireland would be better remaining as a dominion within the British Empire rather than seeking independence. And he was extremely hostile to the Indian National Congress during his time as a civil servant in India. He thought, and he was quite open about this view, that Indian people were not fit for self-government. He was Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab during one of the most turbulent periods in the province's history. He crushed nationalist movements there and later across India more widely. It was him who declared martial law in Amritsar in 1919, in April 1919, after a series of riots. He accompanied troops to Jallianwala Bagh in an armoured car where between 5,000 and 20,000 people had gathered. And without warning, he ordered his troops to fire into the crowd. Between 300 and 1,500 people were killed that day and 1,200 were wounded. Most of the people weren't actually protesting. Most of them were there to visit a holy shrine. It was a massive scandal, and he was forced to resign afterwards, but he still had a prominent public position as a commentator on India, and he ended up being assassinated in London by an Indian nationalist in 1940. He was, in the words of his biographer, Dr. David Murphy, one of the most controversial Irishmen ever to serve in India. And he was such a strong apologist for British imperialism that the anti-treaty IRA planned to assassinate him in solidarity with Indian nationalists while he was on a visit home in 1923. You are sitting there saying, that's all really interesting, Angela. What on earth has this got to do with Russia? I'm getting there. He, before all this scandal, all the really dreadful things that he did during his career in India, went on an 18-month trip around Central Asia. He took a career break to study Russian. What is all this inspired by? Something called the Great Game. Some of you may know about this, and I think this is the reason why he decided to learn Russian and travel around the Russian Empire. This is when the empire's borders, the British and Russian Empire's borders, come with uncomfortably close distance in the late 19th century. The British Empire's borders around India, the jewel in its crown, and the Russian Empire is creeping ever closer to India through its extension of power and influence and land grabbing in Central Asia. The British are convinced the Russians are going to invade India to get access to the Indian Ocean and the wider world. So this is all the Great Game. This is Russian and British race for territory and influence in Asia, and Afghanistan becomes the focus. Whoever has influence in Afghanistan can control the whole area. So Michael Francis O'Dwyer is perfectly aware of all this. If he's a terrible person, he's a smart one. So he understands that he can forge a place for himself potentially in the history of empire and in the running of empire. He represents the unbridled imperialism of the late 19th century. And that's something that lots of other Irish people got caught up in or actively entered into in Russia, in India, throughout the British Empire, and all over the globe. And he's an unfortunate but important reminder of the less celebrated parts of our history as participants in both sides of the history of empire. The autocratic, oppressive Russian Empire, the British Empire that labelled itself as founded in a fit of absence of mind, but no less autocratic and brutal in its own ways at different points in different places. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.